Firstly, I'd like to thank the IISP for inviting me here to speak. This feels like a great honour, and it's high time this profession is recognised. I'm going to explain why I think that's so important in a moment. But hopefully I'm going to tell you a bit about the financial and professional services industry and some of the issues and challenges that we're facing, and a bit about the TheCityUK, which is the organisation that I'm from, and hopefully cover some areas that I've seen mentioned a number of times so far around governance, resilience, policy, that interface between government and industries of all types and regulators. And it seems that these areas are coming up more and more in terms of what the IISP is dealing with, so I hope it's going to be relevant. But more importantly, I think you're following in a great tradition. In the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, royal charters were given to organisations which demonstrated the kind of quality and professionalism that singled them out from other occupations. And that's why we have chartered bodies in things like law, accountancy, banking, insurance, engineering, medicine, teaching, architecture, construction and surveying, to kind of pick up on some of the most prominent ones. And these recognitions were an important kind of signpost for parents, teachers, further education colleges, universities and advisors to guide young people into areas that allow them to develop careers in fulfilling and rewarding fields of endeavour. And I don't think it's any coincidence that in the UK we have an abundance of these organisations that are envied and expanding all over the world. The brand of chartered bodies around the world we see expanding tremendously, and I don't think it's any coincidence that that also means that we have a leading services sector, and it's the biggest actually in the developed world measured by the percentage of the economy, with services in the UK making up to 80% of the UK's economy. Of those, our biggest net exporter is this industry, the financial and related professional services industry. And we are very good at services, and I think it's very important that we embrace that and exploit the opportunities that it creates. I know sometimes there's a feeling that we should hark back to days of manufacturing, but next time you see a politician, can you remind them that 80% of the economy is services before they insist on putting a high-vis jacket and a hard hat on before they go and visit any business? Because there does seem to be a slight obsession, and I noticed it in the media. They were talking about technology the other day, and there was a BBC News report, and they went to examine technology, and they went to a factory which was assembling low-value components, and that was their version of where technology was. And I think that policymaker's focus is often too much on the 20% of our economy that comes from manufacturing, agriculture and fisheries, instead of the 80% of the economy which comes from services and which is the real driver of the UK economy. However, I think it's also important to remember that services do not remain static, and that's vital. A lawyer today, I know we've got a lawyer speaking to us after me, and I hope he reinforces this, but a lawyer today is more likely to sit side by side in the office next to a data scientist than they are to sit next to a bookshelf of printed books detailing the common law cases for the last 100 years. I think that has now become pretty much standard. And of course, the early precursor of chartered bodies were guilds, and similarly they controlled quality and professionalism, and they enforced standards, some of which still remain with us today. But if you take a quick skim of some of the names of those guilds, which still exist today as livery companies, it'll give you an idea of what I mean. Mercers, grocers, drapers, haberdashers, salters, pewterers, girdle makers, wax chandlers, tallow chandlers, and my favourite, fletchers, makers of fine arrows since 1371. Now, I'm not a big consumer myself of arrowheads, nor are many of my friends, family or work colleagues. However, we all use information technology every day, most of which is connected to the internet. And furthermore, your skills are essential to the industry which I represent, that financial and related professional services. The reason for that is that somebody once asked Dillinger why he robbed banks, and he looked at them strangely and he said, well, that's where the money is. And it's very similar to our business. The money and a lot of the assets, digital assets, in our economy reside in banks and insurance companies and law firms. And so therefore that makes them a target. And we were formed almost 10 years ago to support the industry because there was no single body to do that. Our members are leading banks, insurers, asset managers, exchanges, data providers, accountants, consultants and lawyers from across the industry, and about 80% of the top 10 firms in each segment, so if you look across each of those sub-segments, about 80% of them are members of the City UK on this thing that we call the Advisory Council, and we're working on the last 20%, so if you're in this industry and your company name isn't up there, please let me know, because I'd love to come and have a chat afterwards. The industry had no forum where government could convene key players in the industry, and yet it's an industry which represents over 10% of our economy, employs 1 in every 14 people, and in the UK it contributes over £95 billion in tax every year. To be honest, that figure doesn't really make a great deal of sense to me because I've never seen £1 billion. I don't think I'm very likely to either. But in real terms, it means about 2/3 of the NHS budget or about twice the entire defence budget. Now, I'm sure that if that forum, if that forum had existed in times gone by, when all the girdle makers, wax chandlers and tallow chandlers and of course the Fletchers all met by candlelight, that would be great. But in the 21st century that just simply didn't exist. And yes, it's an industry which the modern economy relies on and which everyone else needs in order to be able to prosper. The industry we represent contributes, as I said, over 10% of economic output, but it also employs 2.3 million people around the UK, 2/3 of which are outside London. And I just want to add a bit of flavour to that, particularly as we're in Birmingham today. There are over 30,000 people in employment in our sector in Birmingham, Bristol, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds and Manchester. And this is followed by places like Belfast, Cardiff, Liverpool, Sheffield and Watford, which have between 15 and 22,000 people employed in it. And other centres with over 12,000 working in the sector, like Brighton and Hove, Milton Keynes, Newcastle upon Tyne, Norwich, Swindon and Warrington. And these functions that our industry performs enable the rest of the economy to function. We focus on 3 main areas in our work. Brexit, I think the entire country now has Brexit fatigue, but as an industry we need to make sure that we can deliver services no matter what course the politicians take. So it's a bit similar in terms of the risk management that you might imagine. You have to imagine the worst scenario and plan for that, and then if anything else happens you're reasonably happy. And that's certainly the approach that our industry has taken, because they have had to prepare following a letter from our regulator, so-called Dear Chairman letter, which came out about 2 years ago, and that kind of triggered a lot of that preparation. In terms of the business as usual, for us that's around things like policy making and advocacy, sometimes leading into lobbying. So I would describe lobbying as a particular thing, as advocacy is more about setting the general scene for an industry. And promotion across the globe, and I'll come back to that in a moment in one particular area. But the promotion across the globe is very important. And then thirdly, our vision of the industry's future, this vision that we published a couple of years ago, and where I see the new chartered IISP having the greatest impact. Our work in the vision area focuses around those areas there, around international development and expansion, around talent, around obviously new technology and fintech, around the growing financial centres around the UK, and also around those expanding services around the whole of the UK economy. Because there are broadly 5 areas of policy which all services industries share, and which just really don't have much focus in terms of our government at the moment and governments in the past. And I think with a lot of services, whether it's technology or other things, there's an assumption that that is always going to happen here in the UK. But of course, our industries, technology, pharmaceuticals, etc., they often tend to be very mobile as well. So we do need that support. In terms of our strategic objectives, they focus on the markets that our members serve, so London's global financial centre, and around the UK, Europe and the world. And there's one area I'd like to explore a little bit more fully is the understanding about board level at security and the cyber risk. And I'm going to use the slide to illustrate that in a moment. That was certainly a key part of our vision, which we published in 2017. And the vision really laid out 3 key priorities for the industry, which we felt needed to be achieved by 2025. And you'll notice that the very first of these is that the industry will transform itself further to be highly digitalised, innovative and customer-centric. And what that means for our industry is, number one, that puts you right at the centre of that industry. And that number two, there is a constant churn of change going on with the industry to try and get to that highly digitalised, innovative and customer-centric environment. If you look at the FCA's report on IT disruptions last year, cyber actually only came in number 3. Number 1, the main cause of IT disruptions last year was actually change management, which I will come back to in a few moments. But that certainly does put you at the heart of this industry. In terms of the assessment of where we are today and where we want to be, we still have quite a long way to go. I mean, let's be honest, the industry is, in terms of its reputation, suffered during the global financial crisis and hasn't really recovered in many respects since. But there are those jobs spread throughout the whole of the UK. This is a major UK story. This is 2.3 million jobs and therefore probably around 2.3 million families that are depending on an income from this industry. And our role is to protect and encourage those and make sure that people keep coming to the UK to invest. The UK has been the biggest recipient in the EU of foreign direct investment over the last 20 years or so, and we want to keep that as much as possible like that. We do that for our members, those people that I mentioned earlier on, through the work we do with member firms and through policy development and advocacy and promotion. However, I do want to talk briefly about an area that I think is probably more closely at the heart of what you do. And it's an area that brings together the members of the City UK, which are often chairman, chief executive and directors of government affairs who we deal with, together with you, with the IISP, with CISOs, directors and other leaders within the industry, and that's of course cyber governance, and picks up on a point that I have heard mentioned a couple of times this morning. We believe that there is a key challenge for many technical leaders in effectively explaining cyber risk to boards. And at the moment, there really exists very little common language between the more technical side of businesses and those on the board. And I think that's resulting in frustration from both sides. At the City UK, we've been working on an area to try and bridge that gap and develop a shared understanding of some of those issues where both communities can collaborate more effectively and manage those risks. And this is from a report which we have on our website called Governing Cyber Risk, which we're using with many of our members. We've developed this framework, and I'll show you a bit more on another page in a minute, which can be used by technical leaders to enable them to express risk in a more effective manner to their board, and that's doing that by harnessing language and reporting mechanisms that boards commonly use to manage other operational risk, whether it be credit risk, liquidity risk, or other financial risks. And it focuses around different levels of maturity for areas that we've got up there, like strategy, board ownership, financial resilience, executive accountability, assurance and reporting. And we hope that by putting it in this kind of language, that it means that those boards can understand it. And I would really strongly encourage you, if you get a chance to use it. It allows a way of assessing where your organisation sits in relation to its peers and can be communicated in a language that boards understand and are familiar with from those other areas. And I think this is vitally important. I read a couple of years ago, I think it was now, so things have, I think, moved on. But it was a report, sorry, not a report, it was an article in the FT, and it reported back a conversation that somebody had had with a non-exec director on the board of a big financial institution. And he described a situation where the CISO had been called into the board, and the CISO had told the board how he'd thwarted 1.2 million cyber attacks that year, and the board had told him how brilliant that was, and decided when he'd left the room to award him a bonus. And this guy had left the room, and he said actually when he sat down and thought about it, he had no idea whether they should have congratulated the person or fired them, because he had absolutely no context for it. And I think that's part of the problem at the moment. I think one day most boards will have significant proportion of digital natives who really understand this, and what I'm talking about now will seem rather outdated and pretty unnecessary, and we'll wonder why people struggle with it at all. And I look forward to that day, but I suspect it's some way off. In the meantime, we see this model as being hopefully instructive, hopefully useful in bridging the gap between today's boards and technical specialists, and we're trying to build a consensus around this model so that it becomes common practice. We've had conversations with those who manage the governance codes to see if we can get something like this incorporated into it. And I think that's very important, particularly for those public interest and quoted companies, because that is a real way of getting that common language across. So I'd very much encourage you to consider that and use it in your own organisations. And I'd love to know how it goes. If it's successful, please do let me know. So alongside this, the City UK has developed some groundbreaking work on the regulatory framework that will be developed around operational resilience. Over the past few years, we've seen a convergence of areas such as data security, IT systems, business continuity management and cyber security, all coming together in a broader and more encompassing theme of operational resilience. And I think information security is a massive part of that. But it's really operational resilience in a broader sense that is going to be the focus of that regulation. It's about embedding those capabilities and processes and behaviours and systems which allow a firm to carry out its mission in the face of a disruption, irrespective of the source of that disruption. And this is becoming a key focus for regulators, and I think we're going to see this develop. We've been working with the PRA, which is our Prudential Regulatory Authority, and the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and those are the two pillars in our industry of regulation. One of them focused around the financial stability of firms, the other one focused around their conduct. And what they're telling us that they're going to develop this third operational resilience pillar of regulation, so it's going to become increasingly important. And our job is to make sure that regulation supports the UK economy and helps the UK continue to be a place to locate financial and related professional services. Our mission as an organisation is to make the UK the most attractive place to locate one of those businesses, and that's what we'll continue to do. And I think, importantly, what a number of our members have told us is this is helping to bring this to board attention and leading to a rapid rise in board understanding. And earlier this week, I gave evidence, along with the consulting firm PwC, to the Treasury Select Committee on the reports that we did on this and how it might be developed. And it's clear that the UK is leading the way in this. This is something that the UK is looking at probably before any other country. It's certainly the first country that's looking to codify it. I think because we're leaving the European Union, it's inevitable that we're going to have to find other ways in which to exert our influence. So the UK was a real prime driver in the kind of regulation that went on in the European Union. We did also then have an unfortunate habit of gold-plating that regulation when it came to the UK, but putting that aside for a moment, we now need to find other ways in which we can seek to exert that influence and try and show leadership in this area, and particularly that's going to be at things like the Financial Stability Board and a thing called IOSCO and the Basel organisations, which are the places at which this will be developed. I'd also, because it's relevant today, would like to talk about a final area around skills, and this is taken, the following couple of slides, taken from a report we published last month for a thing called the Financial Services Skills Task Force, which is an organisation that we've set up, which is reporting into Philip Hammond, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, and it brings together a lot of what I was talking about at the beginning. So our industry is very much reliant on professionals at the top end, sort of the most highly qualified end, if you like, but it's also highly dependent on a high volume of relatively lowly qualified clerical and admin people within the industry, and I think we're seeing that changing pretty rapidly. And we need to evolve those skills. We've done a bit of analysis as to where we think that that's going to evolve, and what we're seeing is that there is automation coming across almost every level within the industry. So I think in some industries, manufacturing for example, automation cut out an entire segment of their industries. I think with us it's very different. It runs across all areas and all roles. So I think in that sense it's a bit more like the Excel spreadsheet or email. It allows us a genuine increase in productivity, which I'm hoping we're going to be able to exploit. But it also, I think importantly, is going to result in a big increase in the specialist skills and a big change in the professional skills that we're going to be needing in our industry. And organisations like yours are at the heart of that and are very, very important to that for the future. And that becoming formalised, I think, needs to be celebrated. It'll mean that we're going to need more information security professionals, but also more data scientists, data modelers and data engineers. I was very ignorant, didn't realise there were 3 separate roles. Data technologists, web technologists. And we need our kids, when they become parents, to encourage those roles in the way that parents nowadays encourage kids into law, accountancy, banking, insurance, engineering, medicine, teaching, architecture, construction and surveying. You'll notice the list is the same as the chartered bodies, because these are the new skills which we will need and which help the UK to thrive in that global economy. So I congratulate you on your chartered status. I wish you all the luck in the future and very happy to take any questions.
Great stuff. Thanks very much for that, Marcus. Do we have any questions from the floor at the moment before I ask a couple?
Or generally on financial services?
I'll kick off. I probably don't need the mic.
Don't mind.
Marcus, you did a good job explaining about TheCityUK. You've gathered quite a bit of statistics about talent and workforce. Has that gone down to the granular level that you could give reliable data on how many people are in the security aspects of financial services in the UK?
Short answer is no, but I'll give you a slightly longer answer. I think there's a twofold problem. The problem is the number of people working in those different roles at the moment. We don't have that. If I went to the Institute of Chartered Accountants, they could tell me exactly, they'd give me a breakdown of where they're working, where they're living, and blah, blah, blah. And so I think there's an element where, with all these skills that I mentioned earlier on, data modelers, data engineers, we just don't know where those people are working.
No.
So I think there's a current problem, exactly as you say, but I think there's also a bigger future-looking problem. It's one of the things that we're trying to encourage to get fixed with this piece of work, is there is very little in the way of strategic workforce planning which tells us how many of these people that we're going to need in the future. And that creates a real problem, because we, for example, tried to look at AI and how many AI graduates there were around the UK to try and get an idea of whether there was going to be enough. We only managed to find one university that came back. It was the University of Glasgow. And when we looked at the figures, they were pretty small. But when we asked them a few questions, what we realised was half of those people were actually non-UK citizens and were likely to go off somewhere else when they'd finished their degree, particularly in the environment where having a visa in the UK is made more difficult. So I think there's a number of different layers to this, but certainly there's a current problem, but there's also a future problem around strategic workforce planning and trying to say to universities, schools, further education colleges, etc., this is the number of people we're likely to need in the future.
You also mentioned the model of most financial services organisations having top-end skills and capability, but also a lot of very low clerical roles. So one example I would give you is one of the retail banks in London, for example, put in their budget that they need to increase their current team from 1,800 cyber security people to 2,400. This is just in their London HQ. And if you actually look at how many are real cyber professionals in that sense, and I don't mean to sound derogatory about it, the vast majority of that number are actually people that are reviewing logs because of the inefficiencies of their technology and their systems, and the fact that they have to look at everything to see whether they've got a problem or not.
Yeah.
So what you're doing, I hope I understood what you're trying to do is, I would assume across the whole technology spectrum, is to get that granularity and to understand a bit better. That would help us enormously because we have failed to get that data.
I think it just doesn't exist, and that's definitely one of the things that it's come up again and again. It came up in a report we did in February. It keeps coming up. I think there's also an issue there, which is an important related issue. In his Mansion House speech, and again in the governor's speech, they talked about this need for system of air traffic control. many of the firms within our industry have up to 9 regulators. You know, they have these 2 principal regulators that I mentioned, but they also have 6, 7 or 8, sometimes even 8 other regulators asking them to do things as well. And I think when there's a flurry of regulation which is all about propping up existing legacy systems at the expense of long-term investment, that's exactly the kind of thing that you just talked about that you were going to get. And I know something very similar is going on in compliance as well. A lot of it is very manual, and a lot of it involves vast quantities of data that, quite frankly, the regulator has absolutely no chance of being able to review in any detail. I think somebody told me yesterday that the amount of data that goes into the FCA would mean that every single person employed by the FCA would have to read the equivalent of the works of Shakespeare twice every day in order to even look at it. I mean, that's just not feasible. It's just not going to happen. So we've got to work out better ways to do this. And having people review logs, I just don't think is an efficient use of, you know, what could be people employed in much better circumstances. A couple of years ago, I heard an example. It's on fraud, not cyber. But it was an example of a large global bank that at any one time had 4,000 people investigating what turned out to be false positives in fraud. So credit card transactions that looked like they were fraudulent but turned out not to be. 4,000 people. Now, by any estimate, no matter where they were located in the world, I reckon that's got to be at least $200 million worth of expenditure. And surely those people could be better employed doing something more productive. So I completely agree with you.
Thank you. Yeah, completely. I know Danny's got a question down here.
Not so much a question, but something you might just want to comment on, because I just wanted to absolutely applaud what you said about getting parents to encourage children into these new roles, because I think that part of the problem that we have today, okay, this is kind of untested, this is the theory, but maybe I'll get some grant to investigate, that, you know, going back to, was it 80, I can't remember if it was 1982 or 1984, remember War Games? Everybody remembers the film War Games. So what we've actually had is not a matter of actually encouraging children to go into and use these new skills. We've probably had a generation of parents, don't think I'm guilty, but a generation of parents who have actively discouraged children from taking up these new skills because they've seen it as something a bit naughty, because they haven't understood it themselves.
I completely agree with you. I think there's an element of that. I think there's also an element of the importance of those pathways, because I think if somebody if I'd said to my parents I want to become an accountant, they would have a very clear understanding of what that meant, all the way up to being a finance director or the partner in an accountancy firm. If you said to if somebody said to their parents today, I want to go into cyber, I don't think parents would really have any clear understanding of what that is. But we need to have those pathways. We need to have those very clear structures that go through. So I completely agree with that. And I think it's only through the renewal that needs to go on. You know, wax chandlers don't really do much in our economy anymore, but engineering's still important. And I think cyber will be even more important, and information security probably even more important than that.
Good points, both of you. Right, one question down here.
Cheers. It looks very good, provided there is sufficient investment in the technology itself as well.
Yep.
In the industrial control sector where I work, although we've got lots of improvements, we're still looking for people that can program in COBOL and Fortran and are still using DOS 6.2. And they've got no intention of changing the technology. So how do you see the skills strategy aligning with the technological improvements as well?
Yeah. There's an element to this where you might look at me sceptically and say, well, he would say this, wouldn't he? But you have to just put your scepticism to aside for one moment. I think there's several things. There's one, the self-inflicted damage that we've done on ourselves. So as an industry, part of this report showed that we were the second lowest in terms of the amount that we spend on training. So if you don't spend money on training people, they're not going to get retrained. So there's an element of this where we need to do better and where we need to increase the skills. There is also, however, the other side of it, and that is that all our firms that work for us are competitive firms. They either lose business or they gain business, dependent on how good they are with customers. And I think, I don't think I'm going to get fired for saying this, even though it's filmed, because I said this in front of our chairman and he didn't fire me, so I think it's all right. But our industry previously had a rather poor track record of creating products that were unnecessarily complicated. And then when people didn't understand them, we would just say, oh, well, financial literacy is terribly low. It's appalling. And that would be the kind of standard operating procedure. I think now a lot of fintech companies which have come into the market have really shown that up to be nonsense. And it's a bit similar to, I don't know, probably most of you have got an iPhone on you. It's a bit similar to an iPhone. I have no idea what goes on inside, but I can use it pretty well. And so you don't need to be financially literate in order to have a good product and it service you. And most of our members realise that, so they are desperately trying to become more customer-centric. But sometimes the investment that they're making is being dictated by the regulator, because the regulator's saying, well, you can't replace that, that's too dangerous, you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know what the dependencies are, you haven't mapped it across the whole industry. And so therefore, in many cases, there's this push from regulators to prop up existing legacy systems. That is the worst of all possible worlds. And so, we see this regularly. And, I think it would be fair to say some of the big IT failures that have happened recently, there's been a genuine desire to implement new things. Maybe it hasn't always gone well, but if you look at other companies across the industry, they're implementing thousands of system changes every year, which go successfully well. So I think it's partly the attitude of the industry, but partly the attitude of the regulators, particularly in our sector.
Good point. I've got a question, if I may. I'm sort of railroading it a little bit. You had a couple of slides around sort of governance and around sort of cybersecurity and associated frameworks. And something that I see in my day job is kind of this understanding of maturity or where an organisation wants to get to. You speak initially to a CIO or even a CISO and they say, yeah, we want to be gold-plated. And then you kind of explain to them what that means in terms of time and money. How do you go about explaining that to either members of your group or people you're talking to on a daily basis?
So I think it's a bit similar to the whole concept of information security as a whole, in the sense that people are going to exploit the gap between convenience and security. And that's very much the same in terms of cyber. Yes, you could make your system absolutely secure, but the chances are probably it would no longer be useful. And so I think a lot of it is about impact tolerances, and that's something that very much is the language that boards understand. Because if you say to them, and it's certainly the way that the stress tests from the Bank of England have been designed, if you say, well, if house prices were to go down by 20%, what would that do to your mortgage book? And you can model that, and you can see, and you can make some assumptions. And I think that kind of approach, so rather than the sort of doomsday approach of saying, the whole company is, or in some cases like Maersk, it did go down, but rather than the approach of saying the whole company will go down if you don't do this, I think addressing that and saying what's the impact tolerance for a particular company, and therefore what do you need to do to get to that impact tolerance, I think is a really good approach, because it's the language they understand.
Cool. Yeah, that ties back to your first point on treating cyber risk like the other risks in your organisation, right? Cool. Do you have one question down here?
Yeah, your point on your point on overly complex finance products and the gap between convenience and security. I think in security we've been guilty of creating overly complex controls as well. If I was going to pick one as an example of such a thing, it would be passwords and frequent password changes,
right?
Where we then blame the users for then having weak passwords, like I do, incrementing a number at the end of their password, that kind of thing, when the problem actually is the security control rather than the users. That's just a point I wanted to make, which I think reflects the point you were making about financial products and then blaming the consumer for being ignorant.
I think there is an element. I remember it was a report that came out maybe about 18 months ago, and it was something that I don't know quite how they'd done this, but they'd analysed the passwords, and something like half of all UK passwords were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I mean, there is an element of it where people do have to take some personal responsibility for their own data. But I agree with you. I think it's got to be something that works for the individual. I mean, that's why I like the thumbprint on Apple. I mean, somebody's actually going to have to cut my thumb off in order to have it. Now, I don't think there's anything I own that's valuable enough to do that. But things like that make it really convenient, I think are very sensible. I'm sure there are ways of faking it, but at least it's convenient.
We could do another 25 minutes. There's a brilliant talk on password topologies from IISP about not changing your passwords and kind of real security as opposed to veneer of security. But that's another talk, I think. Do we have any other questions? Anyone? Okay, come over here.
Thanks. You made a play on saying like 80% of our economy is made up of service. So
Yes.
I presume from that you're suggesting that we have a higher service economy than maybe other countries do. So if that were the case, does that mean that we've got a more impact on cyber risk? Should we carry that amount of service industry in the UK?
I think it's a very topical argument. I mean, if you look at across the political spectrum, there is this argument of should you be more focused on manufacturing, agriculture, fisheries, or services? I think part of the political debate says very much, you should go back to manufacturing. My own reading of history is that if you look at the development, it goes through the agricultural phase, the industrial, the post-industrial, the services, and that is a natural development. Somebody like, I think it was Marsh, the insurance company, said that they anticipate that globally, in about a decade's time, 50% of all the assets they insure will be digital assets and not real physical assets. So I don't think this is something necessarily where the UK economy is unbalanced. I just think we're a bit further ahead than other countries. There is only a certain amount of physical stuff that everybody needs. And, we've seen that shift of manufacturing to get further and further down the cost chain. Eventually, those people who are currently manufacturing, their incomes will rise and they will consume all the same stuff that we do. And at that point, history shows us that what they want to then consume is services rather than, once you've got a car, how many more cars do you need? Once you've got a telly, how many more tellies do you need? So I think there is a kind of natural progression towards services. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because if you look at those services, they are medical services, pharmaceutical, they're technological, they're creative. It's not just financial services. So it is something that, for some reason, I don't really know why, but it's something that the UK is genuinely really good at. And if we are really good at it, the classic economic theory tells you should focus on the things that you're good at and not do the things that you're not good at, because you can buy them from somebody else.
Great stuff. I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop questions there because we're running over, and I'm getting told that by the front here. So, round of applause again for Marcus. Great talk.